Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. With me is Professor Pant. India has decided to ban 59 Chinese apps. It has also decided to keep the Chinese companies out uh, from the upgradation of 4G as well as from our highway projects and from the industry sector. All of these have been announced by our union ministers. China is encroaching not only on our land, sea, but also on the digital platform. And this decision, it is also controlling narratives. It's controlling narratives not only in India or trying to control, but world over, intruding into domestic politics, encouraging propaganda. So why is it important to keep China tech out, or rather review engagement with China tech at this point of time, especially when we are looking at a bloody confrontation between India and China in the Ladakh sector? Harsh, when we look at this step, the banning of 59 Chinese apps, which include very popular TikTok and a couple of other WeChat and a couple of other apps that were pretty popular in India, and it had probably of its total users, 1/3 were in India. So what's the significance of India's decision to ban these apps? It may not cause a lot of economic harm to China, to the Chinese companies, in terms of revenue. But do you think it will have a big impact in terms of value or the symbolism that it conveys?
Yes, I think, Nagma, symbolically, this is very important as far as India is concerned, because India is clearly now demarcating or underlining its anger, as well as making a broader point that the traditional understanding of Sino-Indian relations, where the border problem can continue to simmer while Chinese can trade with India, where Chinese can invest in India, where the Indian market was open for the Chinese in every sector. I think that assumption has fallen apart, and India is making it very clear that the onus now is on China to fundamentally reassess whether it does want a relationship with India on a positive trajectory, because India is now willing to bear some of the costs that come with these decisions. Now, as you say, it's not that these decisions are going to be cost free for India. Certainly, there are Indians who would miss some of these apps. There will be for the larger issue of the Chinese investor sentiment, etc. But I think India now is signaling that irrespective of those costs, that the onus now is on China, and India will retaliate in some way and will not allow status quo to preserve, at least on the economic side of the equation. So we have seen, for example, not simply apps being banned, but as you were pointing out earlier, various decisions in various sectors where India is deciding not to allow Chinese companies to enter. And I think that will signal to the Chinese that, look, India is serious about it, and India means business when it comes to a new framework, or when it comes to finding a new framework for Sino-Indian relations that have been ruptured almost beyond recognition by what has happened last month in the Galwan Valley.
But Maharsh, there's also this question that the presence of Chinese companies or Chinese hardware and Chinese platform is a long-term threat for the digital ecosystem in India, or has been a threat. I mean, it applies even to other countries, but with China, especially because of its said ambitions now, and we're looking at Chinese activities, Chinese incursions. Why did we not think of these earlier when we were allowing Huawei to come into our 5G sector, or when we were letting in the Chinese companies? Why was our security not strong enough? The decisions that were taken earlier, it's not that this threat has just emerged.
Well, this is a question I think that successive governments have tried to grapple with, in some ways, because fundamentally, China is such a big economic player globally that an engagement with China is important for all countries, irrespective of where you are. I mean, after all, the kind of the talk that is emanating from Washington about trade and technology decoupling today is a function of the close intertwining of American and Chinese economies. So both, and these are the two countries that are, that you can imagine fighting for global supremacy. and are fundamentally structurally at odds with each other. So countries have engaged with each other over the last few decades at a time when economic globalization was the norm, when the assumption was that greater economic interaction is going to somehow allow you to manage your frictions. So in some ways, the argument for greater economic engagement with China, as far as India was concerned, was also that will allow India to engage with China on issues that are less confrontational, that possibly allow for that famous Chinese formulation win-win situations, where both countries actually win. With Chinese investments in India, India benefits, and also Chinese investors benefit. So clearly, that was something that that was a standard norm for a long time under the economic globalization framework that we operated. The challenge, of course, there was always a challenge with China, because Chinese companies, Chinese capitalism is not really capitalism. It's, as the Chinese call it, which is actually quite right, socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's very peculiar blend where state plays a major role in how Chinese companies operate. You cannot really distinguish between state companies, which are state companies, and which are private companies, because there's no such, there's not a distinction that the Chinese make. And the state pushes its own agenda when it comes behind the garb of Chinese investment, and that has always been the case. And most countries knew it, but they knew it. They also knew that China also is willing to engage with them at a certain level, and therefore can be managed better if there is greater engagement at the economic level with the Chinese. And I think that led to a lot of false starts in this engagement. That is something that is wearing off now across the world, and India in particular, because India, America or Europe can do away with China, but China is India's neighbor. We have to live with it. We have to engage with it to the best possible extent. And that is why I think if you see over the last few decades, despite problems, engagement had been the mantra that India had followed, all governments. Even after Doklam, Mr. Modi decided to give China a chance with the Wuhan spirit, with the Wuhan summit and then Mamallapuram summit last year. The idea was that let's see whether we can create mechanisms where the problems can be set aside and a more robust engagement can be crafted, so that border problem, boundary problem does not become the overarching problem. But that clearly, as we know now, is not working. And therefore, the reaction from India is one which is looking or reassessing its economic options, reassessing its diplomatic options, and reassessing the military options. So we are now across domains, we are looking at multiple sectors. And again, I don't think any sensible or rational policymaker in India would say, let's break off all economic ties with China. That's not, I don't think that's going to be the argument. The argument is going to be, where can we wall ourselves off from Chinese? And I think that's where the sectors that you have mentioned and the sectors that have been in the media headlines, whether it is power sector, government contracts, infrastructure contracts, highways, for example, and other infrastructure projects, as well as technology sector. In those sectors, we certainly want to wall off our sectors from the Chinese encroachment. And that's a message that India wants to send to the Chinese. That's a message, I think, also in the larger context of global politics, most major players are sending out to the Chinese. You have America, you have the UK, for example, after giving China an entry into its 5G network, is now reassessing that. And clearly there is going to be a change of policy there. India, of course, had only allowed Huawei into the trial phase of 5G. I think, if the present trends hold, you can well assume the result for India as well.
So now is the so now is the most suitable time, you feel, to say no way Huawei. When we were talking about China, we also know that China has a national intelligence law, which actually asks all Chinese companies, they are bound by law to provide intelligence to China. And that's something which is very, very dangerous and threatening to any country's sovereignty if you let the Chinese companies in, especially in your critical infrastructure. This decision that the government has now taken, do you think it's very, very effective and it was very important, and this was the only way to go forward? How do you look at this? Because a lot of people, some critics also say that this is not responsive. This is just a reactionary step that India has taken. You need to also have a long-term policy in place before you take these kind of blanket bans. Cannot be the answer.
Certainly, I don't think blanket bans can be the answer. And I think a lot of this is about India trying to rethink those assumptions as we were talking about. Now, but again, I don't think India has, gone the way of a blanket ban. India has gone the way of sectoral banning of Chinese investments, Chinese entry. And I think that's clearly the only way out at the moment. Um, I think if you look at the trade relationship, the investment relationship, given what you were mentioning earlier, given how Chinese operate, I think the fundamental problem here is that the Chinese don't operate or have not operated for a long time on the basis of strict reciprocity. And that's where the fundamental problem lies. Even today, when you look at, they have been complaining about when India banned the apps, they said, oh, this goes against the WTO rules. They very well know that they flout WTO rules every single day. They have been flouting it ever since they became the so-called market, they attained the so-called market economy status. They are not a market economy.
Yes,
They
yes.
don't allow you entry into their sector.
But they have firewalled Google or Twitter.
Absolutely. So look at the state of affairs. Twitter, Google, Facebook. You are banning technologies to enter into your markets, trying to build your capacities, trying to force other countries to adopt your methods forcibly, whereas asking other countries to give you the same privileges that you won't give to them. So clearly, the relationships, economic relationships, have always been very, very unequal. The problem here is that because China grew, such huge in size, countries found it very difficult to take China frontally on. Now, as the costs of that engagement are becoming clear, I think countries are becoming bolder in their assertions. And if you
But the cost of disengagement also, Harsh, is going to be quite expensive. As if you look at India, if you keep the Chinese companies out, then the cost of, for example, your highway project or your pharma companies, the costs are going to go up. And is India prepared for that? Or for that matter, many other countries. But let's look at India. Are we prepared for that? India's decision has come at a time when, all the economic activities already under siege from the Wuhan virus, as Trump calls it, from the Chinese virus. And when all of the countries are also looking at or re-looking at their decision to engage with China, the economic cost will go up.
Will go up. And I think that is what the Chinese are betting on. They are betting on the fact that this is a crisis period, economic crisis period for the entire world. And if you look at their systematic use of military instrumentality, their pursuance of their own geopolitical interests, at a time when world's attention should be elsewhere, world's attention is now on Chinese aggression, which is quite ironical. And I think Chinese are betting on this fact that the world will not be able to take, or major states will not be able to take strong decisions because this is such a crisis point for the world and for nations. So, but I think what India's move is indicating that the costs of inaction are equally high, because if China can do what it is doing on the border, unilaterally trying to change the status quo, then that is something that India takes very seriously and it is willing to bear those costs. And I think that's a message that Prime Minister also gave in his speech in Ladakh when he addressed the soldiers, that look, we are willing to stand up now. And he used this word of expansionism and developmental divide in the world, which is, I think, in some ways, an interesting take on this, because clearly a lot of the world find itself at a time of grave developmental crisis. So you would expect the world towards working and finding solutions to those developmental issues, economic crisis management, etc. But here you have a country who is bent on expanding its geopolitical interests at a time of this crisis. So I think the assessment in India seems to be that if India does not stand up today, then it won't be ever possible for India to stand up later, because things would change dramatically. And I think this is what the Chinese perhaps have also calculated, that if they can make a move today, bend the world to their own pressures, then they certainly can arrive as the great superpower that they really want to be. And perhaps, again, it is perhaps they have miscalculated, because you see around the world, a sentiment is growing, like in India, that the world needs to stand up. So whether you see the Hong Kong issue in UNHCR being raised by 27 odd countries, which India also added its voice to, whether you look at individual countries like Australia mentioning China categorically in its defense strategy, Japanese defense minister talking about it, Vietnam talking about it, of course, European Union after dilly-dallying talking about it, America, of course, has been targeting China for a while. So you see a broad coalition from Pacific to the West is coming up, which is responding to this challenge precisely at a time when perhaps Chinese calculated they would not do.
And China has clearly now given up the policy of Deng Xiaoping, hide your fangs and bide your time. It's come out in the open and probably realized that it's time under the sun has now come, it's now arrived. And that's why we see a very, very aggressive China. But as you mentioned, COVID has also exposed dependence on China, on the Chinese supply chain. Indian action would also invite some consequences. Are we prepared for that? Like I had asked you earlier, also, if we look at our electronics and we look at the pharma industry has been raising concerns and we also have to look at the Chinese investments in our startups. It could be the Big Basket or Snapchat or Paytm. You have the Chinese Alibaba almost everywhere. So it's pretty complicated and complex. There is Chinese investment here in our startups. Our pharma industry is heavily dependent. Our electronics are heavily dependent on the Chinese imports.
Absolutely, and I think that over dependence is costing us. It is costing the world. And if you recall, Prime Minister's statement even before the border crisis with China, he was saying that one of the biggest lessons of this crisis is that India needs to be self-reliant, at least in critical sectors. So I think where the assessment is that yes, we are over dependent, and that dependence is costing us. Because clearly we realize that global supply chains need to be restructured. We have realized that India's own manufacturing, for example, has to grow. And that's a realization, again, that has been in the making for some time now. Before Corona happened, and before this border crisis happened, the fundamental aspect of India bulking up its own manufacturing has been part of the domestic political and economic discourse. Suddenly now it has acquired a new urgency, because you see the real costs in front of you. And as you are pointing out, even when COVID-19, for example, when the world was looking at India for being looked at as the pharmacy of the world, we were reliant on Chinese APIs. We were reliant on imports from China. So clearly there have been issues which are long term in the making. That you will have to, if you have to prepare for this challenge, India will have to do a long-term or prepare a long-term strategy with tangible deadlines, which allow us to expand or build our domestic capabilities to a level where we can take even tougher decisions. And I think if the present trends continue, and if Chinese are not willing to engage with India on terms that India finds conducive, then clearly more costs will come. But one thing which I think both the Indian government and you also hear it from the Indian people is that, when you have a crisis like the Galvan Valley crisis, it also galvanizes a nation in a certain direction. And I think perhaps this is the time when all of us, including the policy-making community, is looking at this issue from a very critical vantage point. And perhaps this will galvanize the Indian decision-making in directions that will allow us to prepare a long-term strategy. But you are right, in the short term, there will be costs. And I think that is why it is important that India is taking these decisions, because India seems to be making this argument to the Chinese that we are willing to bear those costs. If you do not change your approach towards India, if you do not show us credible movement on the border issue. So border issue and the rest of the relationship now have been brought together, unlike in the past when they were disentangled.
We're also seeing kind of rise of digital nationalism, because the digital world was supposed to be one that unifies and that transcends the old divisions. But now we are seeing that the way the digital world is carved is being carved along the same lines which divide the physical one.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And I think what we are looking at now is a unique phase in the evolution of globalization, where important decisions, important aspects of our relationships are also playing out in the digital space. And how that, how you have a country like China that manages that with the backing of the state, and you have a country like India where you have multiple voices, multiple institutions managing that. I think that divide is very clear. The divide is also clear in terms of what Indian policymakers have been talking about, how the digital dependency on China also creates security implications for India. Also, it's issues of privacy, also issues about access. And I think all those issues become very pertinent when you're looking at the digital versus the physical relationship that increasingly are being brought together in a very unique matrix at this particular point in time.
And a lot is happening around the world. Also, before we end this, I want to look at what's happening in Hong Kong, the Chinese aggression there, the security law, the way UK reacted, and then, but it's interesting to look at other countries. China on its security law in Hong Kong is getting support from the Middle East. It's getting support from India's neighbors like Nepal, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. How do we understand this? This is more to do with politics than economics.
Yes, I think, in some ways, Hong Kong issue has become an issue which has taken on a new life after this law. You remember, it's been a year in the making. The protests in Hong Kong have been going on for a year, and it seems to me that this particular security law that the China has just announced, national security law, it is a response in some ways to Xi Jinping losing face in the first round, where he had to retreat, where the extradition law that generated this backlash against Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, and they had to back off. And I think this is Beijing's revenge on Hong Kong by bringing in this law, by making sure that that those aspects of dissent and democracy, that autonomy, which Hong Kongers pride themselves on, are nipped in the bud. They could not do it then; they have done it now, and I think they are doing it now with a particular fierce, with a particular vengefulness, with a particular aspect that, look, this has to be curtailed, because this then gives out a message both to their domestic audience in particular, because they are more worried about their domestic audience. The ordinary Chinese who might feel the lack of democracy being a problem at a very important time, by the way, for Chinese, where many have questioned Xi Jinping's handling of coronavirus in the initial stages, where there are questions about his economic track record, where there are questions increasingly also about his foreign policy. So you find that dissent can get converted into a broader movement. So it's very important for Xi Jinping and Communist Party to stamp on what is happening in Hong Kong and this desire for freedom. And what we have seen is that the global response has been relatively more robust this time. Last time it was, pretty pro forma. Everyone said nice things, but ultimately no one did anything. This time, HRC, Human Rights Council, UNHRC, has been the fulcrum where a lot of countries have gotten together. Around 27 countries initially wanted this. India also joined that chorus, and India had a very measured statement to make on this issue, where I think for the first time we are also leveraging our democracy aspect into this engagement. But of course, there are several countries which will not which will not make this the center point of their engagement with China. China is far too important economically and politically for many countries, including in our neighborhood, which will shape the response of their respective governments towards this issue. But I think what is indisputable is that coming against the backdrop of this larger aggressive foreign policy by China, Hong Kong seems to have become one issue where a lot of the countries would link it to this larger, engagement of China on the global stage, and would question whether China can ever be considered a responsible global stakeholder, or we will forever be looking at a China that has almost gone roguish on the world. We are at a point where we are looking at China, and every single day you question the assumptions that you had made over the last several decades about China's rise. Forget peaceful rise, that's nowhere in the making. But even some of the assumptions that you had made is that China would be reasonable in its engagement with the rest of the world. I think even those assumptions are being questioned. And that perhaps marks a great inflection point in the global order, both in terms of China's rise, as well as in terms of the global response to China's rise.
We're seeing a great pushback as far as the China's roguish behavior is concerned, as you just mentioned. But India got a lot of support when it decided to ban the Chinese apps from America as well, and we are seeing the pushback in Australia and in other countries. But when we look at India's position geopolitically right now, India also features in Biden's speeches. India features in Pompeo's mention of Iran. We know that when Donald Trump's foreign policy towards Iran, what has it been? But now India is also featuring in it when it raises a concern of how Iran would probably tie up with Russia and get weapons which could be targeting this, and also India. How do you see India's position geopolitically?
See, what has happened, it seems to me, in the last few months, and this is very interesting as an observer, is that we have had two trajectories. India, also a country that, yes, is not on par with China in terms of its capabilities, but clearly also a country that was part of a discourse on a rising power, as a country that was emerging in the global power hierarchy. And you had China, which was almost deemed to be the next superpower in some ways in many parts of the world. Now, what the last few months have done, in fact, the first 6 months of this year, have shattered a lot of those assumptions for as far as China is concerned, because most countries today are fearful of the kind of world order that might emerge should China become the dominant player in the international system. And I think those assumptions are being challenged. On the other hand, you have India's, with its own limitations, a certain foreign policy that India has followed, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, that reassures people about India as a responsible actor on the global stage, India that binds its interests with the larger interests of the international community, and India that does not want to revise the fundamentals of the global order. It's not a revisionist state. Whereas China seems to be increasingly a country that is not bound by global order norms. It is not bound by treaties. Every single treaty is being shattered. You can look at India's case, you can look at Hong Kong's case, you can look at the broader case in South China Sea, where now ASEAN countries had to actually come out and say, well, the only way this conversation with China can go forward if UNCLOS, the law of the sea, is followed, the fundamental principles of law of the sea are followed. So clearly, the world is now looking at China as a country that is challenging those fundamental norms, and India is a country that is, that is seen as more reassuring, that is seen as a country that is shaping the larger normative framework of the emerging global order. And therefore, for a number of countries, for different reasons, for their own sets of reasons, India finds, its presence, in those engagements. For Australia, of course, as you point out, you have Australian defense strategy talking about India. For Japan, we have a relationship which is very robust. ASEAN, of course, looks at India as a balancer and increasingly able to articulate a response in line with India's response to the larger Indo-Pacific. America, of course, has been part of Indo-Pacific strategy, where I think what has become more interesting is that this is a time of elections. And so Mr. Biden and Trump administration both seem to be leveraging India as a major player in the globe. And Mr. Biden's comments that India is a natural partner will, of course, shape the policy trajectory of his administration should he come to power in January next year. So I think broadly, stars are aligned favorably for India. Global balance of power is favorably for India, but it is up to Indian policymakers to take advantage of that.
Yeah,
it's not, as they say, fault is in our stars, not elsewhere. So we will see what happens.
The stars appear favorable, but you have to take advantage of the situation. And while India has to stand up for its own cause, and the global assumptions about China are being increasingly shattered day by day, India is being seen as a responsible state, as a reasonable state, and not as a state which is looking at revisionist policies. So thank you so much, Harsh, for that discussion. That's it from us on this episode of Ideas Factory.
Thank you.